Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the caucus. Charles and myself are kind of messing with our own timetable. He's supposed to introduce today, and I was supposed to yesterday, but we're kind of mixing it up and sharing the tasks, which I think is good. So I would like to, take the role of welcome you indeed to the second day of our first weekend of the caucus. At the risk of repeating myself, I would like to welcome everybody and to say how grateful we are that you've all made it from far and wide in the Netherlands, but also from all over the world to join us here for this very vibrant and I hope exciting and experimental process of the caucus, which is part of the longer and larger project that we've been developing called Becoming Dutch. Again, I'm just going to maybe outline, I'm sorry if I repeat it for people from yesterday, but I think it's quite important that we understand the context that we're in order to kind of really enjoy its potential. The caucus is a series of different kind of strategies, I suppose, that we will be developing over the next 4 weeks. Essentially, it's a meeting. We understand the term caucus to be, to have several meanings that we are happy to employ and to think about. One is what is thought to be its kind of original idea, that a caucus is a kind of gathering. It was thought to have come from the Native Americans. And it is a moment where people come together to discuss the kind of the ideas for the future, to take decisions, to vote, to choose in a democratic way how to move forward as a society. And this, of course, we think is simply a very important and interesting kind of model that we perhaps as artists and critical thinkers could also employ, or at least invoke as we try to think about how we indeed live together right here, right now in the Netherlands. And secondly, as Charles explained yesterday, it can also be thought of as a very contemporary political tool, often used in North America by the political parties. They have caucuses where they also make kind of policy decisions for the future. And sometimes it means an even smaller kind of group of people who break off from a larger group of delegates to really make decisions, to really kind of do the work, to think through what might be possible given the information they have and given the circumstances they're in. And so we hope that we, with all the knowledge that we might build up over the next 4 weeks, can take our own decisions, can kind of really reflect and critically engage with the kind of polemic and important and urgent questions of our time, and that we as artists and as thinkers might be able to develop a kind of decision-making process of our own. And of course, for us, one of the most exciting possibilities of this is that we're working towards a large-scale exhibition in May 2008, and we hope that this might be the critical ground through which we can kind of refract and reflect on what artists might say, what we might develop together as a very current kind of moment to think about this notion of becoming Dutch. But I'd briefly like to recap, I suppose, a little bit on yesterday. We started in perhaps a very thought-provoking and perhaps even polemic way, and I hope we continue like this. I hope that you all feel welcome to contribute your ideas, to argue with us, to pick up on certain developments that we might have begun with yesterday, and to continue to reflect and to argue about certain ideas. There's something very special about the structure of this project in that we have not only these public weekends with wonderful and exciting speakers who again we welcome today and we're very glad to have, and an open audience of people who've come to join us to discuss every weekend. But also, crucially, what we have are approximately 35 to 40 participants who have agreed to come here for the 3.5 weeks of the caucus to work with us, to stay in Eindhoven and to kind of perhaps keep the memories and the critical thinking in a continuous way alive, and also to produce hopefully new work and new ideas with us here. And so given that, I think what's very interesting and possible is to constantly try and remember where we're coming from and where we're going to each day. So we began yesterday with two sociologists who we invited to kind of try and explain or lay out a little bit the terrain, according to them, in relation to ideas of national identity, Dutchness, the notion of collectivity and how we might organize and think ourselves. And these two sociologists were Professor Paul Scheffer and Professor Luc Hagendorn. Luke opened the proceedings yesterday in a very interesting way, talking about ideas of collectivity and how perhaps we organized ourselves as a collective, and how this differed, he found, in the results of a lot of his sociological research to one's action as an individual. I think one of the interesting things, and maybe the most thought-provoking thing that came from his thinking, was that his analysis, his statistical analysis, collapsed a kind of received wisdom that the sense of national identity was not a strong thing in the Netherlands. And he gave us many examples of how that kind of, when provoked, seemed to be actually quite a strong and cohesive force, despite the fact that statistically it's often represented as not a very high and important part of the consciousness here in the Netherlands. He noted, actually, something else very interesting when he tried to think about this collective thinking, that perhaps it's the urge to conform that is possibly the overriding sort of motivating factor in our collective consciousness, rather than ideology itself. And this is kind of a very radical thing to think about, that perhaps the prevailing wisdom or the kind of political leadership and the dominant voice of the day is so important, and that it's not necessarily the idea, but rather the need for us all to create a kind of cohesiveness that will accept that idea rather than necessarily believing in the idea itself. And he sort of talked about that in relation to an idea that at one moment the very popular sort of consensus or received wisdom was that multiculturalism and the notion of tolerance were quite positive things here in the Netherlands. But when a charismatic leader like Pim Fortuyn came along, and there was an opportunity to present a very dramatic and different argument, it was quite shocking how quickly there was a change in the kind of collective consciousness. And this was his kind of example of how perhaps this conformity or this need to kind of collectively agree might be more important than actually what's being said. What hung in the air, of course, after that, and that was something we tried to address later, and I hope we address again and again, is if that's the case, then what is the position of political power, and what is the potential for us to actually change this kind of received wisdom, or and this was something that both, I think, Paul Scheffer and Luke Hagendorm rather didn't address, and maybe it's something we would need to keep thinking about, the space, in fact, for changing this kind of consensus, and what responsibility that gives us as political participants, but also in terms of what political leadership can actually do. The second speaker on that level was Paul Scheffer, and he tried to kind of analyze or think through the history of migration, and also to try and think through what the notion of a nation is. And he looked at this via the history of America. He explained at one point a kind of idea of a process of migration, and he suggested it followed a particular pattern in almost all examples. One where he said it starts with a kind of avoidance, then conflict, and then accommodation. And this was really quite interesting, and again quite a polemic idea. And he even came to the conclusion at one point that in fact all examples he can imagine of migration and of a kind of avoidance originally and a conflictual situation always ends in a kind of accommodation. But Sudeep Dasgupta in the afternoon asked a very important question, which was who pays the price of the conflict, and how do we determine this kind of accommodation? And again, I think they're extremely important questions that we might keep looking at. In the afternoon, we had a series of thinkers and also cultural practitioners, which was really exciting. We had Sudeep Dasgupta, we had Abdelkader Benali, and we also had Igor Dobric. And they all are actively thinking through the space of culture. Abdelkader rather polemically suggested that maybe instead of becoming and being, we should be actively trying to lose our identity, that we might try and empty it out in order to reinvent it. And it's not about becoming or being Dutch, but rather maybe we should have a big question mark after this Dutchness, or being anything or being nothing. And these were quite important ideas about the performativity of our subjectivity, this idea that we're constantly in motion. And this was something that Igor really wanted to think about, this showing of movement, the showing of the movement of our identity. And so we really tried to think about whether art might be a space in which we can empty out and renew and rethink identity. And so that's a very quick kind of synopsis of some of the ideas. I'm sure I've left a lot out, but that perhaps I hope we can come back to again and again today. So I'm going to hand over now to Charles and to our panelists for the day. And just to explain something rather quickly as well, that Roger Bergel, who's coming, is a little bit delayed. So we've decided that after lunch we will start with Mario Rizzi's presentation, and then at 3 o'clock we will begin with the keynote speech of Roger Bergel. Thank you.
Yeah.
Working?
How's that?
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah.
Good, thanks Annie, and thanks everyone for coming again.
Yes.
One of the reasons that we're speaking into the mics is that this is also being streamed on the net, so that's why you're invited to speak into the mic. It's not only for the audience here, it's for that international huge audience out there that's watching it. I, again, wanted to welcome the three speakers. And by way of introduction, maybe pick up a couple of points that we could, perhaps for two of the speakers who were here yesterday, also reflect upon. As Annie said, it was interesting that the question of power and the political was sort of absent in the morning session with Paul Scheffer and Luc Hagendorn. And it made me maybe ask a question about whether this was purely about a kind of a political game in which Paul Scheffer, who is part of one of the main parties in the current ruling coalition and is definitely engaged as an advisor of politics at the moment, would want to deny his political agency. And why would he want to deny his political agency? Why would you want to say no? I mean, the only way I think you would want to do that is if you were actually very active politically in that. So there was a kind of an aspect of deceit in that moment which made me feel quite uncomfortable. And then I further started to think about this idea of the description of the open society which he used. He seemed to state on a number of occasions that the Netherlands was an open society, as though it was a fact, as though it was a given. There was not a becoming of an open society, there was a being of an open society. It existed. And I think that might be something that's worthwhile returning to, particularly in the conversations that I hope will happen between our international guests and the people here. I leave it as a question, is the Netherlands an existent open society for everybody in this society? Is it something that we can take as a given? And we can therefore use that nature of the open society to discuss questions of the political and political agency. And further to that, if it is an open society, which also implies a kind of transparency, does that mean that the political process in the Netherlands is basically the transparent reflection of the people's will? Is that the situation that we have here? In other words, as I think these two figures said, that politics is simply the acting out of what, through sociological tests, can be shown to be the will of the people. What Luc Hagendorn with his statistics showed to be people's position, that they were worried about immigration, that they had a feeling that the Jews, ironically perhaps given the history of that, were much closer to them than the Turks. That in that description, are we saying that the politicians simply reflect that state of affairs and simply enact the policies which that state of affairs would wish to bring to being? Or are we saying that politics has agency? And if politics has agency, which obviously I think, this is not an open question, if politics has agency, then how do we relate to it as artists, as a cultural field? Because the other question that struck me also, which was very briefly mentioned, was the question of autonomy. And when Paul Scheffer said that he believed in the autonomy of art, it seems to me, and this is maybe again a question we can come back to, that the autonomy of art is only meaningful when it's being tested. When it's being tested in the field of non-autonomy, when it's being tested in the field of propaganda, when it's being tested in the field of meaning. It's only at that point that autonomy comes to mean something. If it is simply protected, if it's a given space, it becomes isolated and therefore meaningless. It becomes unable to talk about the world because its autonomy is already a given before it even starts, which means that it's not connected to the world. So it seems to me that autonomy, while being a necessary perhaps, or certainly an important discussion point, we wouldn't want to simply push it off the table and say, oh, forget about autonomy. But nevertheless, it has to be something which is struggled over, and not something which is given a priori of any artistic action, of any artistic production. So these two points, the question of power and the question of artistic autonomy and those relations, and again the question of transparency as a kind of linking, or open society as a linking element, remained very much with me, and I know with other people who found the morning session rather quizzical. I think many of those topics we might return to in our discussions, and many of those topics we might find fodder from, food, as we said, from these presentations. I would like to introduce, to some extent rather, other topics today, but I think that they still touch, nevertheless, on these questions with the three speakers who are on the panel. I'll introduce them before they speak so that I don't speak too long, but I think generally we're going to look at the inheritance, the nachlass, the erfgoed, what you said, the inheritance of socialism, communism. Let's say communism to define it clearly. I think that's one of the questions that will come up, not the only question, but one of the questions that will come up. I think just for a moment to relate that to the vanabbe museum and where we are here, it's important, I think, to state that this museum is grounded on Lissitzky. This museum grows out of Lissitzky. He might have come into the collection in the 1960s, but in terms of his presence in the museum, he's extremely important. And it is from Lissitzky in many ways that we can take our lead as an institution. It's from Lissitzky gives us the permission to do something like Eindhoven Caucus as an institution. So this question of communism, socialism is not an abstract question for the vanabbe museum. It's a very, very living question. It's what do we, or what can we do with the nachlass, the inheritance of Lissitzky. And I think this is constantly something that we're busy with internally, but it's also something that we reflect on with most of our guests. So it's from that, it's from this institution and from this place in the right here, right now of having the Lissitzky collection that some of these questions arise. I'd like to introduce Grant Watson, first of all. Grant is at the end of the table here. Grant is a curator at the MUCA in Antwerp. Previously, he was at Project Art Space in Dublin. And he's co-curated and curated many exhibitions. The one in which he will talk about today is one of those that he curated in Dublin while he was there, which was simply called Communism. Yeah. I wonder if you can speak about that.
Quite simply.
Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, so I'll just talk a bit and then we'll play that thing and then I'll talk a bit more. So yeah, when I was invited to talk in the caucus, initially for one crazy moment I thought I might talk about becoming Belgium. Because I moved to Antwerp a year and a half ago, and there are certain parallels, obviously, between the Dutch and the Belgian situation, particularly for me in terms of language and learning Dutch. And then I thought maybe to talk about unbecoming Belgian, you know, in terms of what Annie was just saying about kind of the evacuation of national identities. But through some conversations with Shep and Dmitry, I realized that the agenda today was more to do with art and politics and democracy. So I was just thinking about the term democracy, and obviously in some of the email exchanges there was this kind of problematizing of that term, obviously because it's a term which is used very much as a stick to beat the undemocratic and define it as pathological and kind of beyond. Secondly, I think that Shep described it as a hegemony, right? A hegemonic structure, and perhaps the only possible kind of form of political organizing which is available to the mainstream of politics. And then thirdly, I think, because I think for many it seems to be something which is separate from us, a kind of a form of coercion and a form of state. So I suppose the ambition of a discussion around kind of art and politics or art and democracy might be to think through how democracy could be seen as in a different way, not as a form of state, and possibly as a kind of you know, in its most ideal form as a type of pure presentation and assembly. But obviously that also has the problematic of the notion of a kind of totalitarian edge. So in relation to that, I wanted to put the term communism on the table, having done these three projects around communism. And obviously communism is a term which is kind of placed in counter-distinction to democracy, either as its opposite or as something which will occur once all forms of state have withered away in terms of generic communism and a kind of pure politics. So I think just to start off with, I would just show, to go from this, I'll just show a little clip of a performance piece from one of the projects. This was from the exhibition Communism in Dublin. You got the wrong sound, yeah. You got the wrong sound. But actually it doesn't matter somehow. Yeah, you have the wrong sound.
Can you stop video from YouTube?
That's with some combination. You can leave it. It's actually just sounds. It doesn't matter, yeah.
No, YouTube.
Take that off. Yeah. But you'll see how it actually doesn't matter when you hear the sounds in the performance.
Abrum tatarita, mrututututu, arira, pranta tutarinta, unkaratuta, antitaturata, ni, antutita. Tatarita pantuta, ranita, kundarida bumbuda, bum bum tutu, rutu tutu, maruta cantatita. Tornman strab blan a si irtar, agasara, isnat, utrot, is no, let's speed of not pen at sunglass that teeth from not cast.
So that was one of the projects in the communism exhibition. It was Goshka Matsuga and Lali Chatwind, now called Spartacus Chatwind. But I think the idea to do the communism exhibition came out of a text that I wrote, which was a sort of dissertation on communism. And obviously the whole project is overwhelmed by the name, and always I'm trying to, how do I approach this thing which is so enormous? In the text, I focused on 6 individual figures who had some kind of relationship to communism, and I developed narratives around them that were kind of semi-fictional. In the exhibition, I wrote a sort of a curatorial, I tried to define a kind of curatorial agenda, which was, I suppose, initially trying to kind of bring down the sort of grandiosity of the term, and also allow for the introduction of a kind of improper articulation of that term, and the element of naivety to come in and play. And I suppose in the sense of a kind of curatorial artistic project, I wanted to insist on the ability to assemble material without necessarily marshalling it into an argument. The other thing that I was quite sort of certain of was that it wouldn't become any tracing of a sort of visible cartography of politics. So it wasn't about political sort of existing communist parties or communist structures, and it wasn't about direct activism. So it was much more to do with maybe looking at the kind of texture of the micro-political, and also thinking about what happens when you use a term like communism, the kind of powerful effects that produces in terms of interpolating anything that's kind of positioned under the aegis of that term into a discussion about the political and the collective. So in that sense, I was quite interested in looking at and questioning what constitutes a political work. Then, secondly, I was keen to avoid nostalgia, and in particular, there's been a lot of work done on the idea of kind of mourning communism, the idea of kind of the loss of that tradition. Particularly someone like Charity Scribner, who's written this book, Requiem for Communism, which in a sense kind of makes a list of all these different artistic projects which have taken place in the last decade, particularly in Europe, that look at this sort of loss of worker solidarity. So it wasn't about that, but it was perhaps about the idea of knowledge transfer, intergenerational knowledge transfer. So in the book I produced 2 years later with Bookworks called Make Everything New, which is a line from Machiavelli, which very much talks about this idea of how do you restart from scratch failed projects. I put together artists from different generations. So, for example, I organized a conversation between A.A. Bronson from General Idea and Daunt Rhine from Ultra Red. And I looked at how, in the 70s and in the 90s, people working collectively could learn, well, in the way that, for example, the AIDS epidemic becomes a point of reference for both those projects. And then in another, as part of the communism exhibition, I organized a conversation between Alexandra Meer and Jim Fitzpatrick. So Jim Fitzpatrick is the graphic designer who designed the iconic Che Guevara poster. And Alexandra Meer had been working on a series of sort of manipulations of that image. And it was quite interesting when she discovered that Jim Fitzpatrick was Irish and that the exhibition was happening in Ireland. It's quite interesting for her to discuss with him the journey of that image over the decades and how that kind of radicalism has been folded into the mainstream. So that was so the idea of intergenerational transfer and the idea also of what happens to radicalism, how does it get folded in, how does it still operate within the culture decades after. And quite importantly, I think the idea that when we think now that we're in a moment of impasse in terms of political practice, and there's this question of how do we be political? It seems a kind of impossibility at times. Importantly, I think it's interesting to hear people speaking from 2 or 3 decades ago who said that that's exactly how they felt. It's a kind of a continuous procedure of power to make people feel that they are essentially powerless. I suppose one of the other things that the project tapped into was this idea that art has a tendency to gravitate towards the discarded, and that there's a kind of perversity within art that as soon as something becomes unthinkable, then artists immediately want to start dealing with it. And even, I think, just in a different way, when we talk maybe later about the notion of identity, and the way that identity, the idea of identity politics, is now being discussed as something which is no longer part of the political agenda, I think that automatically you start to see artists and curators readdressing that and saying it's not that simple, you know, it's a more complex situation. But I just wanted to finish off by reading, in terms of this idea of the discarded, reading a short section of text by Wu Ming, who are an Italian collective, who we invited to contribute towards this project. And they produced a kind of genealogy of the word communism called the mu particle in communism, and it's basically going back to kind of a Babylonian period or something like that. And they say, thanks to commies and anti-commies, communism seems to be today's most unpopular, outdated, crestfallen issue. This very term has been bad-mouthed, adulterated, clumsified, and claw-hammered out of political discourse. Time to deal with it again. Thanks.
So our next speaker was born as a Soviet citizen. Maybe that's important.
Okay.
Oh no, sorry, it's Shep next. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Actually,
It was just such a good line that I couldn't resist doing it. I'm sorry about that, Dmitry.
No, it's fine. But, if you
No, Shep, you'll be next. So our next speaker is Shep Steiner, who's here for a week, actually, to run a number of workshops with us in relationship to the collection, I think also in relation to Lissitzky. So he will be around, and some of these issues, I think, will come back over the next days. Shep is an art critic and an academic. He's currently teaching at the Art History Department of Emory University in Florida. He was one of the key people that was involved in the previous caucus, in Court Caucus, in 2005, when he did a workshop, a 3-week workshop, I think, about readings around the coming community. That was actually, it's a Agamben book. I don't know if you know, it's about 100 pages, something like that. I think in the 3 weeks you got to page 6 or something like that. So it was a very close and intense reading of the book, but fascinating as well. He's contributed to recent publications, including a monography of Morris Louis, and has also written extensively about Jeff Wall and other artists from Vancouver, where you used to be based. So, Shep, please.
All right. Thank you very much, Charles. Thanks for inviting me. One point, I kind of hop around the academic world in the United States. And Emory, I taught at Emory last year, which is in Atlanta. This year, I'm teaching in the University of Florida, which is in Florida. And I like to think that it's because I'm so very critical the academy can't take me, but at any one university can't take me. But one thing, just to start, just to address one problem that Charles raised at the beginning on agency, and I'll come to it in a moment, is that I think the subject is far bigger than the agency that Paul Schaefer attributes to it, the agent. So, in other words, one of the things that I like to think first and foremost is the sense that the political is far from being a one-dimensional kind of notion of power, and the political is now operating two-dimensionally. That raises some very complex interpretive problems. And as an art historian and art critic, those are the kinds of interpretive problems that I like to address. The work I do, and I'll just kind of give you a hint of the approach to that kind of problem I take. The work I do hinges centrally on interpretive problems, and the interpretive problems one confronts in our encounters with art. And usually focusing on interpretive problems today means that one does meta-theoretical work on art. So one reads theoretical texts on art, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not what I do at all. In my case, I look at art first and foremost. And I think, in other words, that the kind of close reading of art, which I'll come to in a moment, is far more, opens up to far more interesting and potentially rich political horizons than meta-theoretical work on art. So I don't like the mediation of theory. I consider myself highly theoretical, but my first move is to look at art. So the distinction being that I use theory rather than apply theory. That's a very important distinction, I think, to make. So I privilege one-on-one encounters with singular works, and I try to avoid getting caught up in reading theories about a specific practice or artwork. This is all disciplinary stuff, right? But disciplinary stuff that has, I think, far larger implications for thinking democracy, politics today. So I would say every artwork has a theory of interpretation built into it, something Benjamin says, of course, too. And what I try to tease out of the artwork is simply that, by responding to the work mostly in the most naive fashion I can. So I don't think a high-minded response, a theoretical response, is adequate to responding to work. Naive responses are the most important. A crucial distinction for me then is the sense of using theory rather than applying it. All too often the work we do as interpreters hinges on taking a theory of art we like or that we think progressive, maybe a specific sociological approach, which we kind of heard of yesterday, a philosophical approach grounded in ontology, a political approach perhaps grounded in Chantal Mouffe's notion of radical democracy. That's very popular right now. Or even a theoretical idea like becoming, as opposed to being, which derives from Gilles Deleuze originally, and apply those different kinds of theory to art. And they very often come up with the same sort of answers. I don't want to come up with the same sort of answers, and I think the way to avoid that kind of horizon of meaning that is already presupposed in one's approach is to look at the art, is by close reading. So the kind of application of theory, that kind of application of theory is very misguided, I would say, misdirected to my mind. What it presumes is that we know what the object or practice we are looking at actually is. One of the discussions yesterday was, what is the definition of art? That's a completely misguided kind of question as far as I'm concerned. It's based on our own presuppositions of what art is. I think we need to open up drastically our notions of what art is, because you can just walk through the museum halls of the vanabbe and you can see that you're confronting absolutely different models and ideas of what art is, and absolutely different notions of language. So I would say that there are far too many different kinds of ways of being an artist or practicing art to allow us to think that we can ever define what it is. Multiplicity and difference is far more important for me, and that's a kind of open, democratic kind of gesture in itself, I think. What we blind ourselves to when we apply theory is the very idiosyncratic and particular approach to art that confronts us. Best to steer clear of all and every generalization we have about art. And one of the things about close reading is that very often one comes to a new artwork or art practice with certain presuppositions that one carries from the last artwork. We say, we can go on that. I know something about art. Wrong. You have to start fresh every time. That's very important. So relearn every time with every work of art. And not only between different artists, but within a single corpus of work. That's why I like the monograph, because the work of any one artist is absolutely different within a series even. So the crucial first step is being open to the very peculiar, always different, and usually non-systematic logic of the artwork itself. And I'm very interested in kind of an anti-systematic approach to art. I'm trying to be open to randomness, variability, and non-systematic things. That's why I always privilege the example. The example is that which is exemplary. Its exemplarity is precisely stands within and outside any notion of system. So always the example. Close reading is always in confrontation with the example. Before politics, before bringing on philosophy, sociology, or theory then, I want to be attentive to the particular language of the artwork, which I would say is always different. So my first move is to be open to difference, a democratic gesture, and secondly, to be attentive to the language of the other, which gives a specific linguistic slant to the problem of democracy. So I like to think of democracy in terms of a multiplicity of languages, not simply in terms of the kind of notion of political process as it occurs. I think it needs to be expanded to the notion of language, which obviously has very real purchases on the clash of cultures and multiculturalism here in Holland, right? So before talking about art and democracy specifically, I think a few more words about what kind of critic I am is appropriate. I would call myself a close reader. As a close reader, I read for tropes or tropological systems. A trope is a motif that might occur. Democracy is a trope in current art practice. I read democracy as a trope then. That means I'm attentive. If I'm attentive to tropological systems, it means I'm attentive to rhetorical questions in language or the problems of figural language itself, and always in specific works. In the context of a panel on art and democracy, you would expect the token art historian, that's me, to be more interested in questions of context or politics or migration, perhaps, not figural or rhetorical language, right? But again, I would say by being attentive to such questions, to singular works, in specific examples, one can articulate a far more complex version of these same problems that hits far closer to home. So in other words, I can articulate not my political project, but a very idiosyncratic project in politics that belongs alongside my own in the museum. I want to articulate that other language. It's a very difficult interpretive problematic to get at even the stage of an encounter to or get to the stage of even staging that encounter with the other language. But close reading, I would say, is the crux of that. It dispenses with applying theory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So close reading itself was originally grounded in the tradition of the American New Critics, which was a vein of literary criticism, highly apolitical and mostly a formal affair. Now, the important thing to realize is that close reading, in its present day configuration, was brought to a new height by deconstruction. So I would call myself a deconstructive critic. And I work specifically in the wake of deconstructive critics like Paul de Man, Jacques Derrida, or Gayatri Spivak, who's coming later. Now, I would say the key legacy of deconstruction is close reading. What each of those authors do, I think, is close reading of specific texts. They don't generalize. The things they take out, the kinds of encounters they stage with texts are close. They wind their own criticism into the text itself. That's what I'm interested in doing in art history. So, and I think there's very few art historians that do that. T.J. Clark being one of those, who's a very political and astute commentator, and Michael Fried, who hasn't the hint of politics in him. But that absence, I would say, is pregnant. Maybe. He's thinking about problems. He's thinking about the same kind of problems, but he just doesn't want to articulate them, maybe. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt. So, so by focusing on tropological questions, I push the new criticisms, apoliticalness, and formal descriptions into the arena of deconstruction. So I'm interested in pushing like an apolitical kind of, and we're all formal critics and new critics when we look at an artwork and describe it. That's what a formal critic does, simply describe. And that's an easy encounter with the work. But I'm interested in pushing the notion of description beyond any kind of like graspable identity. So I think I'm carrying on a bit too much. So I'll just speed up. So
it needs to be slow for us to grasp it.
Okay. Okay. So just close reading again is the key like legacy of deconstruction, and it's unfortunate, you know, that deconstruction has basically been swept off the table in the last 4 or 5 years, and it's in fact the key figures probably don't even like using the word deconstruction. It's always just the D word. It's a dirty word because it got them in a lot of problems. But I'm not so like worried about that kind of the serious and mistaken characterization of those critics as apolitical, because the key avenue to thinking the political today is, I think, through deconstruction and through close reading. So, yeah, and one of my favorite quotations from de Man is, quote, "Political theory is in the hands of the aesthetes." It's a kind of very kind of short, little, sweet quotation, and it's from a lecture he gave. And the key text would be aesthetic theory, aesthetic ideology, the key book. I think that's a fairly, political theory is in the hands of the aesthetes. It's a fairly ambiguous statement that could be both very worrying, right, obviously, and which provides an important inroad into rethinking what constitutes the political now. So I think left and right distinctions tend to obscure matters to some extent, even though I'm more sympathetic to the left. And I also think that importing the discourse of politics into the art field a la Chantal Mouffe, for instance, is misdirected. I think the resources, the linguistic resources of art are enough to go on to articulate the political. So I don't like importing things into art. We don't need that. The language of art itself, in its various multiple forms, is enough to articulate very different kinds of politics. And it misses the point of de Man's statement then, in fact, instancing his worry, as well as being blind to the linguistic resources that art counts on as its own. And reading the close at hand, examples from the vanabbe collection, the title of the kind of workshop I'm going to do, will try to example that mode of reading I'm talking about in face of specific examples, right? In the museum, Frank Stella and El Lissitzky, very different kinds of artists, obviously, both using abstract language. And abstraction is a kind of limit case for talking about these kind of problems. It is very difficult. So I think confronting like difficult examples is a good thing in order to like speak to those kinds of problems. How would confronting, maybe I'll just end on that, how would confronting Frank Stella's practice, or the couple of examples that are in the museum, and El Lissitzky's practice, how would that open up the political? Well, if we are attentive to tropes and tropological systems, we are in fact plumbing what I would say is the new terrain of the political. Power needs to be conceived of as functioning not simply on one dimension, but 2 dimensions. Tropology is 2-dimensional. Tropology is a dialectical system. And one of the things we need to realize about democracy is that it is a dialectical system as well. It not only does it give a vote or a voice to those who are in affirmation or affirmative to it, but it also gives a voice to those who say no. I resist that notion. And one of the interesting kind of moment that Grant showed is the kind of historical moment of Dada in Zurich. I mean, the risk becomes to be critical or to be oppositional is to simply act out a kind of absurdity, an absurd kind of stage routine. Now, now I'm not saying that the project itself is doing that, but that's the risk of simply occupying an oppositional position. Because if one occupies an oppositional position, one overturns the hierarchy of reason and puts chance or contingency in its place, like Hugo Ball would have when he was reading his sound poem, "Oh, Gadji Berry Bimba" in the background there or something. But more interesting is thinking reason in its relationship to chance, something I'm not sure Dada did, the historical avant-garde, but I think that Duchamp did, maybe in a more interesting way, in his kind of ideas of getting at art as such. So when, for instance, he places a urinal in front of us and we go, that's not art, that's a pissoir or a urinal. What Duchamp wanted us to signal or flesh out and tease out, because what he's interested in is gray matter, is our presuppositions about art. And by flagging our presuppositions about art, he thinks he can like stage a notion of art as such, and that's a very important kind of distinction. So when Duchamp kind of engages in the problem of art, it's a negative moment, very important, a negative moment. He's not generalizing in any kind of sense of identity. So that said, end of bracket. Power needs to be conceived of as functioning not simply on one dimension, but two dimensions. When power functions on two dimensions, it means that in a system like democracy, power gives a position both to those who say yes and to those who say no or are opposed. Resistance, in other words, finds a place in democracy already marked out for it. That's a key question that needs to be considered. And how does one oppose a system which already gives a place to opposition? You don't want to simply fall into that trap. That's very important. And you could the same goes for the interest in Deleuze, right? Becoming Dutch is a good point. As Sudeep Gupta was talking about yesterday, the tension between becoming and Dutch and the identity of Dutch is a nice dialectical framework. It's very Deleuzian, however. We need to go beyond a simple overturning of identity for becoming, which is like written throughout Deleuze's work. One needs to go one step further. In fact, the Deleuzian moment of overturning metaphor, identity, for metonymy or migration, rhizomatic kinds of flows, is not quite a fully functioning dialectical system. Deleuze values what underwrites reason, underwrites metaphor, and in so doing values flow and becoming. One in the high tradition of thinking and in the high tradition of fully dialectical thinking, one needs to realize being and becoming as part of a binary system that is topological. Because as soon as we value becoming, it flips, and that becoming becomes an identity. So in other words, we need to keep the system spinning. Art is such a system. It is topological. So is democracy. So we need to first get the system spinning at an ecstatic rate. That's the moment when you can realize you're actually in an engagement or an encounter with tropology itself. Tropology is a logic. Tropology, the logic of tropes. Democracy's place to an affirmative voice and a negative voice is a tropology as well. So that's a connection. And when we approach a work through close reading, what we need to do is, first of all, identify and get into some kind of dialogue with the language the art is putting forth. It's a logic of an artist. We're not looking for history or context. We're looking for the logic of a singular individual and in a practicing artist. Every single artist's idea of art is absolutely idiosyncratic. So we need to get at that logic. And when we get at that logic, we can get at tropology. When we get at the level of tropology, then we can open it up and look for some kind of aesthetic suture, which is a very important moment, and brings us back to de Man, who would tell us that to think the political now is to stage an encounter with the art object in which we're able to open up a kind of relationship between being and becoming, and see or find or locate the blind spot of that dialectical moment, not a negative moment, but a passing moment in a dialectic, an aesthetic suture. So I have more to say, but I'll stop there.
Shep, thanks a lot. That was wonderful. And also, Shep will have much more to say over the next week as well, and we can interrogate and try and find the tropes within your own talk and see if we can set up some sort of dialectical system spinning. But thanks very much. And I think it's a really helpful description also in ways of thinking about many of the problems that we'll encounter over the next 3 weeks. And I hope we can hold that in our minds. I'd like to introduce Dmitry. And I've just lost my biographical information, sorry. In the middle is Dmitry Vilensky, who was born in Leningrad in 1964 and now lives in St. Petersburg. He lives in the same city. Just the name changed. He's an artist and a cultural activist, and in 2003 initiated the platform Что делать, that's what is to be done, which is a famous term not only from Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, but also from Chernyshevsky. It should be remembered that there was a predecessor to Vladimir Ilyich. He is the editor of the newspaper of the same name, and that newspaper and certain projects that Что делать have been involved in over the years are actually available in the Disobedience Archive and also in the Rodchenko Workers' Reading Room in the exhibition Forms of Resistance. So Dmitry is a participant within Forms of Resistance. He's also an artist together with the group Что делать, and actually one of his works is in the collection of the vanabbemuseum and will be shown in the next 12 months. And his work is mostly done within the context of the collective, I think, and includes video, photography, text, installations, and interest in architecture. He's participated in international exhibitions and exhibitions in his own country, in Russia, and it's really a great delight to welcome him here. And
thanks, Jared, and it's a big pleasure to be here. A few times I was quite recently, and again it's great museum, and actually it was very important what Charles said about that relations to the topic of Caucasus, to that kind of point of departure of the major work and collection in vanabbe as Lisitsky. And actually for us, I'm not speaking right now, sometimes I'm mixing I and we, because actually I'm part of a bigger group, and sometimes it's a shame to speak in behalf, but at the same time you can't escape, because it's a matter of collective. So when you be kind of spokesperson, you have to speak somehow and try to understand what means that collective identity. So, closer. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, so it's better? Yeah, good. So, and actually, it was very challenging invitation, because actually, as far as you might guess, actually the Russian context, and particular the idea of Russian national state, that it's very fresh. I just put to your attention that Russia as a state, as a national state, never exists. It was Russian Empire, it was absolutely another political construct. So it's mean that actually is a history of Russian national state in a sense of European national states, more or less. It just started maybe less than 20 years ago. So, but at the same time, it's also very difficult to engage in this dialogue, but at the same time, I think that voices from outside could really enrich this discussion, because things that we are facing, it's actually, I mean, they have kind of global nature. It doesn't matter that how different models of democracy we have in different countries. At the same time, the essence of new race of new nationalism, it's somehow these challenges are presented everywhere. That's why for us as a group, I mean, could be nothing else more frightening than becoming Russian. It's really frightening. And also, I mean, can you imagine that we are coming from absolutely another historical perspective? For example, as Charles mentioned, I was born in '64 in Leningrad. I had a passport of Soviet citizen. It was absolutely another international idea of construction of citizenship and something that overcomes that nation differences. And we can speculate quite long about it here. I see some people who are kind of part of ex-Soviet Union project, and of course we might have different position on it. But at the same time, I would just provocatively say that actually at some point it was a very successful project, very brutal, but successful. So, because at one particular moment, at the end of 70s, beginning of 80s, I think that actually it looked like, luckily, that in the level of everyday, particular, that the national conflicts were overcoming, and we really have some incredible common ground. And actually it was very interesting concept of art that was actually very late doctrine of socialist realism. It was formulated national in form, socialist in content. That actually allow a lot of variety of national traditions, like Uzbekistan tradition, but at the same time kept that common socialist communist ground for some different sort of messages and enunciations. So, but today I really, there was some alternatives how to speak to, if I should represent my work or the collective of work. And I think that time limit that we have, because it's really many things that we are doing, it's a group of 10 people, just briefly to say, that actually very much involved into repoliticization of art, and just to make kind of productive conflicts with what Shep said. Actually, our idea is more about translation of political experience into cultural and backwards. For example, I'm working on the concept of artistic Soviets, that kind of models of council communism that actually can somehow execute kind of counter-hegemony in cultural production. It's also very complex balances of powers, but at the same time, I think as long as we understood it in kind of, was not old-fashioned, because I still think that council communism is the most challenging political models, and actually without any, it's not saturated. Okay, I agree, party-saturated concept of politics, absolutely. It's many other. I'm quite sure that, for example, liberal democracy, absolutely saturated. It's a fake. It's absolutely manipulative system of it's fake in many senses. So it doesn't matter if we have a very sophisticated version like in here, or in a more old-fashioned notion of sovereign democracy that we have in Russia. And right now it looks like again that old-fashioned repressive models are coming back, and it's really frightening. So I decided that in my talk I would focus on two cases that might bring us to fruitful dialogue about the general topics that arise in the case of Caucasus and that particular ideas becoming a Dutch. So first case, both cases that I choose deliberately, they related to art and history. First one, I would like to bring your attention to very interesting and very problematic conflicts that happened in Estonia And I'm very happy that here we have two people from Estonia that can correct me if I'm saying or distort some facts. It happened around movement of Russian monument dedicated to fallen soldiers in Second World War. It's also very important to remember that, for example, that construction of late Soviet identity was built on the victory over fascism. That actually in official Soviet, no, I wouldn't say ideology, was represented as united factor for the all nations that was part of Soviet Union. Because we're all fighting with fascism, paid for that incredible price. That was kind of one of most important mythological, even, yeah, because it constructed as a myth, but at the same time it was reality. So, I mean, and that's something, some common ground that we share all together. So, and then, of course, in the course of disintegration of Soviet Union, of course, appeared a lot of new national states, and they were challenged by the construction of their own identity. And it was really tragic process because actually, you know, through the history of Second World War, and I think here we also have to return many times because actually, for example, you can hardly imagine that construction of European identity without relation to Holocaust. You can't escape it. So it's something that happens. So it doesn't matter that we can talk and speculate about nice existence of Jews, but we know how it someday is finished, you know. And actually, it's very important case that for Russian and for Soviet history, that the idea of fighting with Nazis was really important, crucial moment. But at the same time, in 1939, with the Pact of Molotov-Ribbentrop, where Europe was split and nations were really faced with a devil choice, either for Stalin or for Hitler. And unfortunately, many people in that particular situation decided that Germans or National Socialism for them looked more temporary, attractive model. And right now, I think that it's a big trap, for example, how you reconsider your national identity between this, again, that goes from the past. So, and in Tallinn, there was very famous monument, not so famous, actually, nobody paid any attention. It was just normal monument dedicated to fallen soldiers. Yeah, Estonians call them occupants, but at the same time, there was a guys who liberated Tallinn from Nazism. So I think it's kind of obvious fact. So, and also then for a long time, there was no conflict. The monument stayed somewhere, nobody bothered about it. And then it started, I think, with some activization of kind of grassroots activities that, for example, Estonian nationalists, I think they started first. Is it correct? I'm just checking, yeah? Yeah, that's why I get in press. So there was one meeting where they, yeah, okay. They just throw some paint red the soldier, and then Russian minorities, actually, to call them minorities, it's also kind of a little bit exaggeration because it's about more than 30% of population. And most of them, excuse me?
They're not all Russian. It's a big generalization. To speak about Russian minority, they have actually.
I think people can't hear, so maybe you could come back.
Okay, later. I'm talking my version that actually I was trying to be as more correct as possible. I think that most of that Russian minority don't have a citizenship, and actually they live with the papers of non-citizens. It's a very unique document. It's like citizen of the world. It's really very interesting. And they started to protect monument from kind of vandal attack of Estonian nationalists, and then to pacify situation, Estonian government decided to move a monument to one side, to military cemetery, a little bit outside, at outskirts of Tallinn. And it escalates situation amazingly. First of all, it's also very interesting how we also consider the issues of democracy, because it's some simple definition. It's, okay, it's the power of majority. And of course, this definition of democracy at the beginning at the risk of populism. Okay, what is majority? What they can decide? So actually, but at the same time, if we're talking about just formal procedures, I remember that most different pools about that idea of movement of soldiers, actually most of Estonians, and of course Russians were against it. At the same time, there also were some cemeteries that also they should make excavation and move the remnants of soldiers, and also protested by all confession from Jews, Catholics, Protestants, and whoever, because it was better not to touch it. That's quite obvious, from kind of ethical reasons at least. So, but it was implemented. So, and one day it's really brought into incredible outburst of very simple, very wild riots in Italy. And also just actually, you know, it's always very interesting to work with some visual materials. On YouTube, I found one very interesting footage that was done by Estonian national TV. But on YouTube, you have very incredibly direct and fascinating comments by Estonian nationalists who made in English, just commenting events, and the language. It's actually the language of direct conflicts that come to the street. And you see the Russians, and you see that very symptomatic comments. So that is the case. For example, I think it's a very complicated case. First, it's connected with art, because it's around monument, because also art and history, it has very special relations. What we have in public space, we have different monuments produced by different artists that we inherited from the past. And our relation to these monuments constitute our current relations to art and history, and also our imaginative things. And actually this conflict in Estonia, I think it's one of the most challenging examples, because actually in these two sides, that blindness of that nationalistic forces, it comes to the fore without any possible solution, and actually somehow more or less unsolvable in that sort of situation of open society, without incredible criminalization of one of the forces. That's really a problem. That's what I would like to point out. So maybe we can start with the video. It's 8 minutes. Is it okay? Maybe we'll show just a part.
Just show a part.
Yeah, just. And then I'll. Ah, yeah. I hope it's readable, because it's really small.
Fascist shouts avant-garde of minority, ironically appropriate self-identity. That's amazing, man, that actually I was like... Okay, you got it. It's actually quite amazing. There are heaps of videos actually online, but this one was particularly important. And actually, as I told, I suggest as a case for maybe discussion, and actually as far as I heard from Charles and Annie, that actually you have a seminar that also somehow will focus on this case that makes sense. But second case, because I think we have to run, it's, can you show one image, the first image? Yes. That's a piece of Hans Haacke. I used to live in Germany in 1999. And do you know, you familiar with this particular piece by Hans Haacke? In 1999, he was commissioned by German Reichstag. It's kind of Kunst am Bau. It was after reconstruction of Reichstag, to produce a new art piece for Reichstag. And yeah, it was commissioned. He was invited by a special committee of experts because Reichstag has a very special art collection. And he suggested very simple piece, because if you show one third picture, just third, no, not this one, yeah, no, not this one, another one. Go ahead, one more. Yeah, because on facade of German parliament there is very famous slogan, dem deutschen Volke, to German nations, I would say, because it's plural, Volke, because German consists of different lands. So. And Haacke answered with very simple and somehow direct response. He suggested in one wing of Reichstag to install dem deutschen Volke. And can you return to first image? Thank you. Very simple slogan, no, like the sign, der Bevölkerung, to the population. What, okay, I won't tell the whole story, because actually it was actually quite complicated piece, because the deputies were supposed to bring some soil, and actually quite obviously it was challenging that idea of nation with idea of population. Of course, in current political situation, you could hardly imagine that Haacke would suggest to the citizens, because citizens quite strong identification. But in the case of Germany, where a lot of people denied citizenship, even who were born there, I mean, it was absolutely impossible. So his answer more or less predictable. Okay, let's confront and see how particular that highest organ of democracy, because it's German parliament, will react on that proposition. And of course, Haacke was clever enough, he's German actually. I mean, that actually in German constitution, constitution, there is a sign, who is the sovereign of the power in Germany? Of course, it's German nation. It's still there. It's very interesting how people are trying to reconsider and maybe come up with enlarged concept of nation. But at the same time, it happens that for most of right-wing deputies, like from Christian Democratic Party, even such a modest proposition was totally unbearable. Okay, what's that? Population, I mean, okay, we are a German nation. But I would like maybe to strengthen, but at the same time, from right now I'm talking in my name, that I think that if we would like to challenge that kind of old-fashioned or even new definition of nation, we are always losing, because nation is a very strong concept. And actually, as long as we are reconsidering some sort of citizenship based on that vague idea of population and actually participation in political life, I think it's tragically limited, particularly what you said, that we should again to think of communism. Because the only one idea that we have in 20th century that could challenge that nationalistic madness was the idea of working class, of universal humanity that come over that national limitation. And the tragedy of our moment that right now, even such kind of left radical artists as Haacke can't work with this, because it would be definitely look totally stupid if he would suggest to the working class. I mean, can you imagine? I'm also coming with my Soviet background, where, for example, such a sign to the working class, to the people of labor, was more or less common. On the main squares, you have a big transparent and signs to the working people, and everybody understands. It's the only one identity that can actually reach that universal dimension and change the world for better. And I really, at the moment, very skeptical, because sometimes I feel very down, sometimes I feel myself as sort of international intellectual artist in the time of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Can you imagine the position of Brecht sitting in Denmark? I'm in Denmark right now. Just understand that fascism come together with communism ever to escape to America. Okay, nowadays there is no escape to America. So that's for sure. And I think that I would like just to put your attention to the tragedy and dramatic situation and development of that discussion of nation, and I think it's in many sense we are trapped. So to reconsider a new nation or updating this concept, including its open society, different part of the groups, I think that somehow it will be unreconcilable in many senses, and we'll be facing with much more radical challenges than what we have, for example, next Soviet Union and Balkans, and the Balkanization of national issues. It's really the threat that can, again, kind of ghost return to Europe any moment. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. I think it's now, we've got a good half an hour.
Yeah, I hope that I was...
And I wonder, I'd like briefly to summarize the three of your points. And meanwhile, I wonder if you could think about questions you'd like to ask of each other, so that we could start at that point in order to have the conversation. We started off with Grant Watson, and this will be a very partial summary, but maybe to draw out some of the points. And as what I found interesting about Grant's presentation, apart from the exhibition itself, was the fact that you were kind of using... does this not work? Oh, I can turn this on, maybe. It's a little bit easier than you can. Is that better? No? Is that better? No? Then we have to share it, I'm afraid. Okay. Ron's going to fix it. What I found interesting was that you were using communism almost as a kind of empty signifier, in a sense, that it seemed to be that the communism, when you spoke about communism being a redundant and discarded notion, which we can therefore reinvent, there was a kind of emptiness to the idea of communism from the show's point of view, which then could be filled with a set of perhaps radical or political expectations, but that didn't necessarily have to relate to historic communism, to real existing communism. And I found that quite a liberating possibility, at least, to think about. I mean, it maybe has its problems, and perhaps you can comment on it. But nevertheless, I thought it was interesting that we might not have this overloaded term always having to struggle with its past, but actually being able to allow the past simply to exist as a sort of separate signification, whereas the signifier itself of communism might depart from this history. And that breaking apart of the two, I think, opens up some possibilities in our thinking as well of what this possibility, because I always come back to this argument, which I think was also present in Paul Scheffer's presentation a little bit, but this Zizek argument, which I think is very powerful, where he says that what the right do regularly is whenever we talk about emancipation or want to talk about emancipation, then they say, oh, well, it's all very well, but that leads to the gulag, so let's forget it and let's get on with the free market. And that's it. End of argument. If you talk about emancipation, you're a Stalinist, full stop, over, close of argument. It's the same that Paul Scheffer mentioned when he said any art that is not autonomous is socialist realist. Full stop, end of argument, let's get on with it. And I think those kind of definitive statements in that absolutism is quite dangerous. So as much as pulling agitprop, if you like, away from real existing agitprop, pulling communism away from real existing communism is a kind of interesting move to make in that exhibition. Shep, I mean, it was a fascinating talk, I have to say, I think, on many, many levels. But I found this question of the question of agency and where agency lies, perhaps as an art historian, to be quite an interesting point. That in a sense, you're saying that your agency as an art historian, perhaps as our agency also as people engaged in art at different levels, lies very much in the terms of art, or on the terms of art. And it's from the terms of art that some sort of agency can be provided. And again, I found that quite I don't know whether that's true, but maybe you can comment on it. And I found it again quite an interesting possibility that the idea of agency, which is something that we want. Yeah, we want to be able to act. We want to create the conditions where what we do has some impact, or what we do allows us to do further things. And that I think the idea of connecting to theory or connecting to politics is often an attempt to try and give ourselves agency within the art world, to give ourselves an agency which is beyond the market, beyond the idea that you simply produce products which are then sold at the Basel or the Frieze art fairs. At least it seems to me to be part of it.
You know, agency is not given, it's taken. You know, you can't give agency.
But maybe we can take agency, it's a good point, but maybe we can take agency through the terms of art itself. And I found that again something which maybe you could comment on, this relationship between your close reading and the idea of agency within the art field could be quite interesting to comment upon. And I suppose the other point for Dmitry, which was most interesting to me, was the fact that you were, it seemed to me, engaging in close reading, despite your difference with Shep. That you were actually saying that it's necessary to focus on specific examples, and that those specific examples are quite different. So the Haka example, or the example of the monument in Tallinn, actually provide quite different kinds of possible results. That there are quite specific addresses which are given. Not only specific addresses in terms of their histories, the history of the German, the Deutsches Volk, the German people, nation, whatever, ethnic identity, however we translate folk, it's not easy, and the question of the socialist or communist inheritance in Estonia. So again, it felt that even though you were saying you wanted to connect the politics to the art, you needed, in a sense, to start from the art in order to make that move. So I wonder if maybe we could start with Grant and your comment on play for a start, or on the emptiness of communism.
Yeah, I think that the idea of emptiness obviously is kind of rather awesome, but what I was thinking of in a way was this idea of no prior engagement. And when I was developing my ideas around the show, I read this aphorism by Adorno, which was to do with temporal sequence, and you probably know it off by heart. I read it 2 years ago, so I can't recall it quite correctly, but it was somehow, in a very elegant way, he draws this line between the prior engagement of a lover and through a whole sequence of things to the notion of totalitarianism. And so what I was thinking of was this idea of the possibility of a kind of contingency in which you come to something with no prior engagement. And I think that, looking at the clip from YouTube and thinking of that context and thinking about many other different contexts, I think that maybe this exhibition that I did couldn't have happened in those places because the prior engagement is too present. But particularly in Dublin, in a context where, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Annie, but the legacy of communism doesn't lie heavy. It doesn't lie heavy. There was a Soviet in Limerick, and there was a very interesting bookshop actually next to Project that we tried to engage, but they said that we were anarchists and they weren't interested. So I think in that context, I think it was about a kind of license. It was about a license to maybe play with this idea of no prior engagement. And I think going back to the piece that I showed, I think that in a way it wasn't so much about kind of restaging a radical moment and claiming it, but it was. This is my reading of it, but because with the project I just said to artists, look, the show is called Communism, what would you like to do? And then they came up with different things. But in that situation, I think for me it was almost like, what do you put into that space of no prior engagement? And what occurred in that space was a kind of slightly impoverished theatre. It was a kind of theatrical moment, but without the resources to really make that grandiose or any of those other things that we were trying to avoid. So I don't know if that's in any way deals with that question of.
Yes, I think so. Maybe we can return to it, but I'd also like to involve the other two speakers, and then I think we can go on.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you'll allow me, Dmitry. Just like seeing the other the presentations and hearing them, I think what becomes clear is that, to me, is that politics becomes very situational in the sense we're talking about. And if it's situational, I mean, the repercussions of that is that even though we'd like to think that we're always like standing on firm ground, we're not. I mean, so that Grant couldn't have done his project in Dublin elsewhere is interesting. And I mean, obviously what I said before about like not being, not kind of resisting left and right politics has absolutely no kind of purchase on the examples that Dmitry has just shown us, because obviously the terms are completely different than the ones that I'm used to operating within. So might as well just get rid of the kind of generalization that I put forth, because the terms are so radically different in every context that one has to be absolutely sensitive to that. And I think in that respect that I do like to think of like the highly apolitical moment of standing in front of a masterwork in the art gallery and thinking of that as a potentially political moment, as loaded and rich as staging an exhibition on communism or being on the streets with Dmitry. I mean, oh, but in a sense, imaginatively. But you know what I mean? I mean, those different kinds of, all of those are potentially all very highly different forms of the political. Each is like political only in terms of the situational kinds of context. So I like that kind of thought. But I'd also say, just to like kind of give a little hit back, the kind of notion of a working class as an alternative, the only alternative to nationalism. I mean, I agree somewhat, but I wouldn't like not take that on, but I'd also say in the context of the way I'm thinking about things, I'd like to think of an alternative to nation as like radically heterogeneous kind of elements or examples making up a nation. They constitute the nation, but they are at the same time completely asystematic. They completely escape the notion of nation, and I think that's a kind of very kind of productive thought, because in that sense, even in the context of democracy then, one has to kind of, in the Dutch situation, to bring it back there, I mean, the question of language and the question of cultural differences, who are, which are, they are, all framed by a notion, are, you know, constitutive of that particular nation, but radically heterogeneous to it as well. I mean, they make it up, but as examples of nation, they escape it. So that's the kind of problem of the nation state that I really like to think, because I mean, it seems like you have to, instead of thinking from the top down, I mean, you have to like look, you have to start reading from the bottom up and find the multiplicity of different kinds of being in a nation, and then seems to me would be productive to map out those radically different kinds of linguistic positions and work from the ground up. So that gives you a completely different kind of a landscape. And it also gives you a kind of, lines up with what Dmitry and Grant was saying also about the fakeness of the notion of democracy, because it becomes simply a kind of hegemonic structure which neatly serves as an umbrella term for us for different moments in it.
Okay. Oh, I have two immediately. Okay. First, actually, I agree with more
things that you said. But at the same time, don't you think that right now maybe we are too much trapped in that politics of differences and identities? And actually, I'm not claiming here and not advocate the devil position or advocating some totalitarian, authoritative, homogeneous. Not at all. But at the same time, we lack in that universal. What do we have in common? For example, recently we have one shocking experience. It's also very just to my mind, very close to the issue of the Caucasus and becoming Dutch. We're making a drift with 16 beaver in Paris, and actually Irene and René, they arranged a meeting with some information group from that came in the wake of that riots in French suburbs. It was an amazing meeting. We were staying 2 hours trying to understand what people want, what we can share in common. We don't like lefts, we don't like friends, we don't share any common background. Okay, language may be, but because they have different ethnical background, Moroccan, Algerian, so. But then we totally collapsed to find anything in common. There was just, okay, what do you demand? Our rights to dignity. Fine, great. How you determine dignity? There's nothing, okay. We couldn't find any language. It was such a catastrophe. I was so depressed. Nice guys, actually. I mean, in a way of, kind of, you can share that kind of hate to power. That's good, but at the same time, we're trying to constitute something. So that's why, for me, you can hardly talk about that negation without some affirmation. And for example, for me, if you return just a few remarks on that we already said here, that for me, for example, when you talk about the dialectical situation between being and becoming, I think we should maybe think more paradoxically. You must be always being and becoming at the same time, simultaneously. That actually it's more comfortable for me terminology that about instituted and instituting power. Okay, right now we have too much about it's about that imaginary structure, fluxes, becoming. Okay, guys, we must every time fix ourselves at some particular point. It must be political fixing with very determined political position. In many sense, here and now. It doesn't mean that it will not be changing. Of course, it will be changing, but at the same time, I think it's also important. And last thing that I want to say about possibility of productive translation. For example, we definitely agree, and for me it's kind of common sense, that there is such a thing that autonomy of aesthetic experience. Of course it is. There is autonomy of aesthetic experience. Okay, what come into my mind, how to compare autonomy of aesthetic experience? Okay, there is power of living labor. All people who labor have particular power. It's existential, ontological, whatever you say. But we can repeat it as many times as we possible, okay, aesthetic experience, living power, nice, but without forms of organization, of potentiality of living power, power of living labor, it's nothing. That's why for me, for example, as long as we're not connecting that autonomy of aesthetic experience that in many sense come close to your idea of detailed, very precise reading, we can hardly implement that knowledge into life. That for me, for example, I may be too much practical. Okay, I'm an artist, we need to do something as political activist position. We should implement our knowledge in life and then get some backs and then how we develop our positions and our situations. And I think that without imagining, constructing some particular forms of organization, discussing them permanently, we can hardly speak about that potentiality of living labor. Okay, the same thing with autonomy. Okay, autonomy is a political project. And that it's important to understand in the wake of autonomia operaria, so Italian autonomist project that was really made a break with the party politics, the trade union politics. That's how we translate that experience into cultural field. That is important for me. So.
I want to turn it over, so please prepare your questions. I'm just going to ask Shep to respond to that because I think it was quite important. If you could, I know it's probably hard, but Maybe I suppose I want to actually mention a term that was used by Roger Burgel, who's coming later, when he spoke about this question, rather sort of haiku conversation or presentations that he would do at the before Documenta opened, where he would basically repeat the mantra of how do we become more. And this idea of how do we become more seems also to touch on this idea of organization, because the question is when we have all these located situational specificities, when we have this close region, which I think is I think we can all agree that it's very necessary. But it also seems to be, for instance, in a museum, you know, we have in the plugins that you see here, we have a series of situational specificities. But at the same time, we have to think, and I think we're burdened with this responsibility by our nature as human beings in society. We have to think about how do we become more than those specificities. And I wonder, it's to ask, to address that point about what happens to the close readings. Is it possible to connect them? Or is it something that you would even want to attempt as a project, to connect those close readings one with another?
That's the remapping of something like hegemony. That's how it would begin, by starting from the ground up and in the multiplicity of circumstances. But I'm not sure exactly what you think I should respond to, but one thing I'd respond to is that I don't think we need to fix identity. It happens naturally and spontaneously. I'd say that's the problem, right? That's precisely the problem. And in that sense, becoming is a negative moment of being. And when you say constitutive, when we use the word constitutive, it means it's self-originating. That there's no history. That's the problem. So how does one find a negative moment of something that is constitutive? It's a kind of paradox. It's an impossibility from the first move, right? So how do you begin to think of a more? Well, you begin to think of a more in terms of a topological structure, in terms of a negative moment of identity. A negative moment of identity would be becoming. But so beyond identity and difference, becoming would be different than difference. Well, that's simply a topological system. But what is more than a topological system? It's a kind of outside of system. That's I think where some things become where the new terrain of the political becomes far more exciting, maybe to think. But you have to think, first of all, you have to be thinking rigorously in a dialectical fashion about those things, because first of all, there's no possibility literalized or materialized in the world. They are negative linguistic moments where possibility begins. Deleuze's kind of opening up of that problem is through metonymy. You have to go one step further, and you have to think the beyond of a tropological system. What that is, I don't know, but it seems that's where the kind of exemplarity of examples kind of comes into focus, because those things are completely outside of system, and it's a complete chaos out there. That's why I can be like completely sympathetic to self-organization. That's a great thing, I think. But yeah. But I don't know.
No, I'd like. Are there any questions now from the audience? Yes, one at the back. If you can wait for the microphone, please. I think we can actually do this. It's easier, no? If we just hold it rather than carry this stupid thing around.
This on? Yeah. Okay, thank you for your very interesting viewpoints. There's one thing that I sort of miss in this whole debate is that on one side you put art, and on the other side you put politics, and it is the interaction between the two. That's a lot of attention going to. But what I miss is the role of the media. There is, in democracy, there is, let's say, the public opinion is an important factor. But as I understand it, that the public opinion is greatly influenced by the media and the information. You mentioned the word propaganda ones, and also YouTube is a new kind of media to influence, and also this self-organization. Hey, people tend to repeat each other's standpoints and those kind of things. So I would like to have your comments on the media.
I was just going to actually go back to your thing about art and politics. And I think that, in a way, I disagree with what you say, because I think that actually the attempt is not to produce them as two separate kind of camps. And going back to what Dmitry was saying, I think that you know, this notion of what is to be done, which is like in a sense a question of how do we organize as an artwork that was produced by Susan, and I think in collaboration with you, perhaps, or independently. Anyway, it was part of the project, and I think that one of the interesting things about the context of art, beyond or before the notion of propaganda and kind of dissemination of information and sort of persuading people, is the idea that it can be a space in which certain kind of problematics can be addressed. And in fact, I went to this talk by Spivak last week, and she talked about the double bind, and she talked about not art, but literary texts being able to operate within a situation where they can incorporate a number of incompatible elements and not necessarily resolve them. It's a kind of inhabitation. And I think that, for me, that's kind of where potentially art can be a political context, because when you have the notion of an impasse, and you have, for example, the idea of you know, all our different identities and the complexity of that, and how do you think of the universal when you think of that? I think that art is a possible place where that can occur. So I don't agree that the conversation here is about dividing the political and the artistic into two camps. I think it's much more about thinking about how do they conjoin.
Would anyone like to answer the question about the media, though, more specifically?
I mean, I think I certainly was talking about power, and when I talk about power, I talk about spectacular cultures. It's pretty clear it's there, right? I mean, right from the first step. I mean, that's why you're trying to think through power in a two-dimensional way, or even oppose it. So, I mean, just speaking for myself, but I could hear it as well in the other speakers, I thought. So, it has to be, right? I mean, it's the culture of the image. I mean, that's what we're kind of confronted with and trying to think through, all of us, I would say, as a first step, right? But without even mentioning the question of media. So it's a good point that you raised, but I think it's inclusive of the kinds of ways that we're approaching it.
You know, I think it's also a very important question, because actually there is media, and actually right now it's a lot movement in art. It's not about embedded journalism, that's also extremely important. And right now, as we see the closure of public sphere, for example, we see that art open its door for a lot of things that, for me, more or less kind of embedded political journalism. That's very important, because they don't have any other spaces in public sphere apart from museums or whatever cultural venues you call. But at the same time, I mean, it's also, we have to understand that it's a big struggle right now. It's happening, for example, for the influence. For example, that's why all of us somehow engaged in so-called that concept that came in the wake of tactical media. For example, right now we talk about that, how we open the borders of art and determination what art is. I think it's very important how we combine the different functions, but at the same time not compromising that most important issue at stake, what art is. And for example, that's for me happened when art is politics. That's no separation, because we are not talking about management structures of distribution of power and resources. No, we're talking about essence of politics. And essence of politics, actually, some notion of art is the same, I think. For me, it's kind of equality in this terminology.
Yeah, I would want to make a remark on a notion that was mentioned a bit in the margin of the discussion, but that is linked to becoming being, but also to what was mentioned about communism and Derrida, and that is the notion of the ghost. That what is haunting us. It seems to me that that notion escapes the dynamics between being and becoming, because it's neither something that is nor something that becomes. It's not a reality, it's not a fiction, but it's somehow present. And I wonder if we could elaborate on the idea of ghost, also the ghost of course of communism and the spectre de Marx as a Derrida that haunts us, but at the same time also think about what the role is of the ghost in the construction of our identity. It's something that haunts us without us being able to say exactly what it is or to locate it, but it's always there and ungraspable, but its existence cannot be denied.
Well, it's a great question, right? And especially in the context of Grant's project and Charles' description of it as a past as a past, but with a future not yet filled in or something. But I mean, I understand. I haven't read the text itself like closely enough to like comment specifically on that. But I think I think the way I kind of figure it in, I think of it as pure futurity. I would say the aesthetic suture, which binds being to becoming, and which is blind to us at any single moment, is precisely that kind of ghost. And if in close reading, as I understand it, when Lacan returns to Freud, or when Derrida returns to Marx, I think what they're reading for is the kind of that moment of an aesthetic suture or blind spot in those key texts that they return to. What they open up then is that moment of pure futurity, and it seems to be an extension. It's what the aesthetic suture in that sense is what enables a politics or a project or a logic to be articulated at any single moment. But it is something that one has to return to in retrospect to actually kind of flesh out of a text, because it is a blind spot. It drives a dialectical system, logic. So pure futurity, and Benjamin has it too, in some sense, it kind of emerges in a more messianic sense, right? But it's kind of, I like that notion. It's a good.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. That text is one that I read when I was developing this project, and I think that the idea of a kind of completely empty space, of course, is not possible. But the way that I imagined the notion of a haunting was through the idea of a refrain. So you're in an empty space, but there's this kind of, occasionally there's this refrain that you hear, that you recognize, that you don't quite know where it comes from. So it's not that the space is completely loaded down with information and facts, but there's this kind of ephemeral musical refrain that goes through that you can pick on, and sometimes it's there and sometimes it isn't. So that was the idea of a notional connection to this kind of, this ghost, or this past or whatever.
I mean, it's a banal point, but it's worthwhile remembering maybe is that, of course, communism is introduced as a spectre in 1848. So, I mean, it's already a spectre before it even exists. So its future is already ghostly at its moment of introduction in the first words of the manifesto. More questions? I'm also looking up there because I realize a lot of people have joined us and are sitting at the top row. So. You're also allowed to ask questions from there. You're not banned. That's great. I think we need to get you one of these microphones, though. If you could come down here, and the microphone will come to you and meet halfway. Now he's going to be completely invisible now.
All right. Completely.
Thanks very much.
Down, then. I don't know if I can grasp it completely, but it comes from two speakers. For me, almost. You were talking in a system, and for a moment, sorry, I ran down for a bit.
Take your time.
Almost going outside of the system, and I'm sort of struggling with this question of, can we still talk about ideas and situations when it's almost about, you were saying, is it so micro-social or so micro-language? Do we share it, and can we then discuss about it? So, can we come up with answers, really? Is that sort of my question there? Am I making...
Yeah, I think. Can I try and pass it on? I think it's this question of is the micro level so small that we can no longer communicate between one micro situation and another?
Right.
Is it you're worried that actually it falls apart?
Yeah, because right now I'm in this energy of this discussion, so I can totally adapt to it. But at the same time, I could be somewhere else and agreeing on something totally different. So can we still come up with solutions and answers in terms of art and politics, in that sense? That matter, no? Because here it matters, obviously, and so it goes somewhere. But for a larger group or a larger progression or idea.
I mean, is that what is the impact then that these kind of discussions might have on a larger, in a larger framework, or to
yeah.
Is that?
Because actually it's quite complicated questions regarding the impact, but at the same time I wouldn't agree, because actually look at the history, because maybe it's also a very special local position. For example, any sort of decent voices in Russia in the history were somehow losing. I mean, they were kind of a losers, the history. But at the same time, in historical perspective, they were always winning. Look at the history of, first Marxist cells. For example, I don't know, if you're talking about our situation, I think we are throwing like in the middle of 19th century when first wild accumulation of capital happened in Russia. And actually, the idea, I can dare to say so, because it was different capitalism, but introduction of capitalism, situation of introducing something new, it's absolutely comparable. That's why for us reference to Chernyshevsky was quite important. But actually, I wouldn't undermine the power of that micro communities, because we are producing something incredibly important. That for me, it's really very important to return to that kind of historical perspectives. Okay, we are working here now. I don't care how marginal I am, but I really trust in what I'm doing. And I'm quite sure that we are producing incredibly important knowledge for the future. I don't know, otherwise I could hardly survive. And actually what we share with other micro communities all over the world, that's why our project is more or less international. That was internationalist and international from the beginning. So I think that we share some kind of ideas for applying non-existing communities with possibilities of their constituting and becoming whatever you call it. And I think the development of that language, okay, look at the history. How many people participated in constructivism? 20, 100, 200, all over the globe. And other movements, they are always kind of marginal group of people. And right now it's just mainstream bullshit. How it was actually appropriated by mass culture, museums in many sense. Because actually, but for us, it's very important to think in a term of not tangible object. We are producing few works, and it's okay. But at the same time, it's about composition. Avant-garde was always about composition of text, writings, every day. So that actually can be developed only through some micro-community. That's actually when you really negotiate your personal subjectivity with collective we. That's how actually where politics starts, where 2, 3 people, or more than 3, normally start to think at which point they can somehow get rid of oneself and start to speak we for kind of practical moment. Like political action, you have to organize picket, you have different opinions from where to organize, what kind of signs should be. But in one moment you do it, Because at this particular moment, you agree how to carry out this political act in the name of we, of that group identity. Then it can be split it again. But it's very important. I'm not sure that I really catch your question, sorry.
Well, yeah. Sorry?
I think he is meaning that it's like the Tower of Babel, that we have maybe run the risk that people can't understand each other anymore if you look at it too much on a micro level. That was, I think, your point.
Yeah, or rather on a rational.
Well, I would like to comment on that if possible, because I work for 20 years as an art critic, and I've also these questions about how do we interpret things. I was very intrigued by your proposal of close reading, because I think we really should start with the beginning, what is there, and what inbuilt ideas are behind these works. I think it's a good thing, but one thing that is keeping to surprise me is that it seems that artists on the moment are very afraid of limiting themselves to one meaning. So, for example, I was busy with Anthony Gormley, and there was a reaction from Louisa Buck, and she said that we don't have a shared iconography. And I think that is what he's also meaning. How can you get across what is in the art? Actually, the answer is that artists wants to ask you a question. I think that is the most important function that art has in our society, in our open society, that art is a medium to ask us questions. And that is, I think, why artists are so afraid to really be tied up in one meaning, because they want to invite you to search for yourself. And I think that is a very strong function. But the thing is that it is not often realized, it seems, in the public, because people want to have answers and they want to be comforted and they want to have certainties. And that actually is also one of the sources that people are nationalistic, because they feel insecure. I mean, that is out of this discussion, but I think it's a pity, because I think, why do people want to identify with something, with anything? Because they feel insecure in a globalized world. You have no securities anymore. The groups are disintegrating. So, well, I think that's enough.
I just want to come back on that, because I have to say it worries me a little bit. And it worries me we're going to see Roger Burgel later, and Catherine David will be here as well. And I think we had in 1992, I think, the documenta of Jan Hut, that what had as its main framing device the idea that art does not provide answers, it asks questions. And I feel that in the subsequent 15 years, we've, in a sense, moved on from that position. And I think we've moved on from that position in important ways, because the idea, that what you're assuming in that, is that there is a question which can be asked. You're assuming that there's not a sense of a language, a vocabulary, a set of positions which we need to build up. So what you're doing is you're identifying an already open society, which you actually mentioned, but in a sense an already existing society, an already existing language of art in which a question could be framed. And I don't think we have that, and I think it's good that we don't have that. Because if we had that, we would have basically a totalitarian notion of art. An art which is already predefined, and in which questions can be put. In other words, you would have a body of knowledge which is art, and within that body of knowledge, questions can be framed in quite clear ways. And answers are not provided, fine, but nevertheless, the control mechanism is fairly significant. And the control mechanism was traditionally through the museums and through the galleries and through the old system, which developed during the 20th century largely. And I think, what Catherine David's documenta certainly for me did was break through that, or start to break through that, to show that that position historically was not a real reflection of the historical condition. It opened it up. It united poetics and politics and said that these two things were intimately related. And intimately related in a way which neither had a certain system, in a sense, what we were talking about, which you could then rely on to ask the questions within. And I think Alquiz then took it on to another direction by introducing the notions or the consideration of the global into it, which was there in Catherine's but not. I mean, there were many other exhibitions, but just because the documentary in '92 asked this question already, I think I would hesitate to go back there. I'd hesitate to go, it feels like we're 15 years ago if we start to say art is about asking questions. I think art is not about asking questions, nor is it about providing answers. It's about perhaps building up or trying to think about the possibilities of ways of speaking. Anybody else wants to come? Another question?
I get it back again. I have a question that actually is maybe more specific about the autonomy of art and politics, especially concerning funding, which is a major power. Money makes the world goes round. I'm based in Switzerland, and a couple of years ago, Thomas Hirschhorn made an installation in Paris at the Centre de Suisse, which criticized the right-wing government in Switzerland. And this provoked a huge debate inside the government of Switzerland, and they actually, at the end of this debate, they cut the funding to Pro Helvetia of 1 million francs. This was a very specific political and artistic discussion then going on within the art community about what is the relationship between politics and art, and especially with regards to funding, because now it's happening more and more that anytime there's a critical element in the art, and if there's any government funding involved, they immediately start talking about cutting the funding. I just wanted some comments on that.
I don't know. I don't want to. Do you want to take that?
I don't really. I wanted. No, I mean, I wanted to just think maybe more about what you were saying earlier, which was this idea of what is the. Should we answer that question?
Yeah, maybe, and then you can come back on that one. I mean, I mean, yes, that's true, and it's inevitably true, and there's constantly a negotiation when you're in an institution with the kind of possibilities or the parameters of political funding. And that funding clearly, we are accountable. I am accountable in this museum, if you want to say, to the city council, to the gemeenteraad, for those of you that are Dutch, and that accountability is fairly clear and transparent. And there obviously would be certain points where it would cross the line. I'm not sure what the Thomas Hirschhorn example does beyond being a specific example about Swiss politics, because I think that each control mechanism within at least the so-called open societies in Western Europe is quite different. So the direct censoring that to some extent happened in Hirschhorn's case was something particular to the Swiss situation, it seems to me.
Well, yes, of course it's particular to the Swiss situation, but I think the problem is that funding in general for the arts, I mean, I don't know, maybe in Switzerland we have a lot of funding for arts compared to state funding for the arts compared to many other countries. And I think the problem is that because of the right-wing government currently and everything is shrinking, the budgets and so on, that they're always trying to cut funding in some ways, and now that they're using this as a control mechanism to try and it's maybe, I mean, I don't want to go into but they want to make sure that nothing is super critical about the government, and I don't know if this is a problem only. You think this is a problem only in Switzerland?
I think it's in a sense a problem of public funding. Full stop. Public funding has certain desires. It has verlangen. It has opinions, and those opinions are what you're perhaps, if you want to work within certain ways and receive public funding, you might come across. I think that the place where you might come across them is different. But I mean, that's what public funding is, just like private funding, just like a private collector has their own interests. I mean, money has interests, no? Money is not neutral. I mean, there's no such thing as clean money. All money is incredibly dirty. That just seems to be an inevitable state of engaging with a capitalist system. And in this case, it produced that. In other cases, it would produce other things. But it can't be avoided. The idea that money can be disinterested is I'm sorry, I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's an absurdity, I think.
But sorry. Yeah. No, I was just thinking, I mean, maybe it's more a question, because I think that obviously the funding situation is different in each instance and in different countries and whatever. But I think that maybe it's more a question about how do you relate to the structures that support your practice. And a kind of test for me was when I was invited to do this communism project at the Frieze Art Fair, which is which is in a way, a kind of. Actually, no, I wasn't. I was invited to do something at the Frieze Art Fair, and I couldn't work out what to do. And in the end, because I was working on this, I thought, well, this is what I want to do. I want to continue this project in that context, and. It kind of, it was a little bit of a dilemma, and in fact, some of the people that I've been working with didn't say no, but they kind of said, like Susan, for example, was a bit like, well, I don't want to be part of that, But other people did become part of it. Sarah, I collaborated with on that. But the way that I worked it out in the end was I linked up with Resonance FM, and it wasn't a defiant thing. I didn't want to go there and do the project and be defiant and critique the market and make it that, because that didn't seem to be the appropriate or the kind of right spirit. But what I did do was I worked with Resonance FM that had a booth in the art fair, and we broadcast the program to London. And in fact, it was not available within the art fair. So it was kind of, in a way, like a parasitical relationship to those structures that didn't resist them, but also wasn't completely entangled with them and caught up in their operation. So I don't know if that's any use as an example.
Yep. One last comment, then I think we're going to have to close it for lunch.
You know what I prefer to, instead of following the money trail back to the state censoring, back to the art market and its various censoring, is I prefer to put pressure on myself as a kind of locus of money, and that's why I'm interested in putting pressure on kind of certain meanings, to go back to your other questions, because the kind of questioning that you're posing, or the kind of line of questioning you pose, usually leads to kind of enlightened kind of position on institutional critique. And I find it far more kind of interesting to think of myself or the interpreter as an instancing of the institution, and the instancing of the institution in terms of the trace of one of the end runs of the money trail, or whatever. I mean, that's what that's interesting in institutional critique, not looking at the actual institution and its kind of funding. We know it's a given. It's like, what can you say? But looking at the way interpretation instances that whole complex is my preference.
And I can see there are some other questions, but I'm afraid we're going to have to stop. I'd like to thank enormously for this session Grant, Dmitry, and Shep. You can applaud now. And to say that we'll start, I think, with Mario. I hope Roger is on his way. And with Mario, we will start at about 2:15, and then around 3:30 we'll begin with Roger Burgel, and hopefully come back to some of these questions. Thank you very much.